Good evening and welcome to the November 2022 meeting of the Linnean Society of New York. I'm your president, Rochelle Thomas, who will now call the meeting to order. For those of you who received my recent president's letter, I want to remind you about our upcoming cleanup this weekend at Cedar Grove Beach in Staten Island. For those of you who did not receive my most recent letter, I encourage you first to become a member and second to check out the news and conservation sections of our website, in addition to our social media channels. And for all of the members attending tonight, a gentle reminder to pay your annual dues if you have not done so already. Tonight, as always, we've disabled the chat feature, so if you have a question, please type it up into the Q&A box. Our Vice President, Gabriel Willow, who hopefully isn't out chasing Manhattan's first ever yellow-headed blackbird, will answer your questions at the conclusion of the lecture. On to business. Thank you to everyone who submitted votes on the items listed in last week's President's letter. Motion number 1 to accept the following members of the Linnean Society passed unanimously with 146 in favor and 0 opposed. New members and sponsors are Annie Wilker, sponsored by Miriam Rakowski and Evelyn Huang, Sarah Lisiandro, sponsored by Asta Skizzer, Paul Bobbitt, sponsored by Lenore Swenson, Hannah Hui, sponsored by Ronnie Almonte, Arias Concepcion, sponsored by Sylvia Alexander, Heidi Nong, sponsored by Amanda Bilskis, Marie Cohen, sponsored by Leslie Fisk, Paul Cohen, sponsored by Leslie Fisk. Welcome to our newly elected members. Motion number 2 to accept the October 2022 meeting minutes passed with 144 in favor and 2 abstentions. And now I have the honor of introducing Roger Pasquier. Roger Pasquier is an associate in the Department of Ornithology at the American Museum of Natural History. A member of the Linnean Society of New York since 1968, his career has been in ornithology and conservation at AMNH, the U.S. National Museum, World Wildlife Fund US, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the National Audubon Society. Tonight, Roger will present Birds in Winter, Surviving the Most Challenging Season.
Ready for me to go?
On to you. Yeah, on to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rochelle, for introducing me. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Winter is coming, believe it or not, and to me, it's one of the most interesting aspects of the avian life cycle, and I hope I'll give you some inspiration to look at it and what we can see birds doing in winter with care this year. Winter affects about a third of all the world's bird species. I'll focus on familiar North American birds, but remember this is a global phenomenon. Winter is the season when it's colder, windier. That means there's less food. There's also less light, which means there's less time for foraging and longer nights to get through. And this goes also for migrants that go from high latitudes towards the equatorial regions where the day is more or less 12 hours, far less than they had even if they were at our latitude during the spring and summer. There's also much more competition. The young of the year, they're in a much smaller winter range. In the Western Hemisphere, thinking of the birds that go long distances, most of those long distance migrants go to the Caribbean islands and to someplace between Mexico and northern South America. And if you visualize that on a map, it's a tiny area compared to the regions in which these birds bred. Think, for example, of the birds of the boreal forest, whose ranges are from the Maritimes and northern New England all the way across to Alaska. There are also other wintering species with which they can may be competing, as well as many more resident species in addition to the migrants. There are also more predators the farther south you go, and the winter season is longer than the breeding season, so there's more opportunity for birds to deal with difficulties. And of course, for birds at higher latitudes, there are incidents of extreme weather. What are the ways that birds deal with this? Some of them stay put, some of them migrate. But within migration, there are many different kinds of migration. There's partial migration where some of the population will move from an area while other birds will not move at all. There's short distance migration, which is to say mainly in our context within the United States and Canada going just a few hundred miles, and long distance migration where birds go much farther, essentially to tropical areas or even beyond. There's also altitudinal migration. We see some of that in the Appalachians, but far more in the Rockies. And just to remind you, migration as a winter response is widespread in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America, in Africa, and Australia and New Zealand. We see very few examples of that. The shearwaters and storm petrels that come into the Atlantic and the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, and the skuas that go from far southern latitudes to the North Pacific. Other than that, few of the austral migrants even reach the equator, and even fewer cross it. Now, Gabriel is going to be our projectionist tonight. So Gabriel, if you will start with the first slide. The first thing that most people want to know about birds in winter is the impact of feeders. For chickadees, it has very little impact. The studies that have been done in Wisconsin with flocks of chickadees that are too far from feeders to be aware of them, and others that live in neighborhoods filled with feeders, found that winter survival was pretty much the same through winters. But there are lots of interesting things that we can enjoy from watching the birds at feeders. First, while many people might think that it's the same loyal group of chickadees coming back and forth all through the day, it's often a succession of visiting flocks that are moving through the neighborhood. And there are also many changes in behavior that come with birds using feeders rather than feeding in natural situations. Chickadees, for example, with an abundant source of food, don't have to spend their time moving conspicuously through open woods. And so while they're not actively feeding, they go to the least conspicuous places that they can find, so that for those times of the day, they're not visible to predators. Next, Gabriel. Gabriel, there, thank you. For other birds that are at the margins of their range in the north, like the Carolina wren, feeders can be quite important. One peanut, for example, is the 1/3 of the daily metabolic needs of a Carolina wren. And since Carolina wrens feed mainly on the ground, when the ground is covered by snow and ice, they are pretty much stuck. And that's why the populations in areas with a lot of snow fluctuate, and few survive over the course of the winter away from feeders. Next. So among the interesting things that you can observe from birds in winter and at feeders is that chickadees, for example, start forming their winter groups, at least where they are stable, not like the ones that are invading us right now here in New York. They start forming their winter groups in August and September. These groups have a stable social structure with a dominant pair and 4 subs who are not their own offspring. And if one of the chickadees is lost during the course of the winter, it might well be replaced by another one that's not part of a group, but it usually starts at the bottom of the hierarchy. Another thing that these groups of chickadees do is homogenize their vocalization, so that all the vocalizations of the chickadee calls of each group become more and more similar, and separate them and distinguish them from neighboring groups. One of the other things that we see chickadees doing is caching food. Chickadees are among the birds that we call scatter hoarders, where they put a different item of food in a different place, well concealed, so that they will be able to retrieve it later on, often weeks or even months later, with the hope that no other chickadee or anybody else has found it. And dominant chickadees in each of these groups tend to store more than the subordinate ones. And for all of them, the hippocampus, the part of the brain that is involved in memory, expands every fall to contain the knowledge of where each bird has hidden so many seeds and other little bits, and then contracts at the end of the winter. Next, some of the other scatter hoarders include the blue jay, which, as you know, buries a lot of acorns and is one of the major ways that oaks spread and maintain their range, germinating from the ones that the jays have forgotten or never retrieved. Next. Red-bellied woodpeckers, you can see this in Central Park, where they're particularly fond of locust trees at this time, will put fruit like crab apple or cherries in the grooves of bark. I mentioned locusts because those have particularly deeply grooved barks, and you can see them doing this. I see them regularly in the row of locust trees that runs from the Delacour Theater up towards the reservoir. Next. White-breasted nuthatches also store seeds and other little bits, usually in cracks and branches, sometimes coming down to the ground. There are other hoarders like owls and the kestrel, and some that are called larder hoarders, where they have a single cache where they put animals that they have caught and killed. They don't usually leave them in their cache that long because these things would decompose. So they are retrieving things far more rapidly than the scatter hoarders. Let's look at some of the short distance migrants. Next, please. The dark-eyed junco is a classic one at our latitudes, and its gender and age distribution runs from generally adult males most far north down through females and younger birds farther south. There are some young males that winter as far north or even farther north than adult males, and this is believed to be in the hopes that they will be able to reach a territory and desirable territory and defend it before an adult male gets there. The adults may come later, but they usually have the what shall we say, the moxie to defend those territories and drive off the young usurper. Some other birds are eruptors. Let's have the next, Gabriel, please. Everybody's favorite erupting species is the snowy owl. For a long time, it was thought that owls and other eruptive species moved south when food was scarce, but in fact, more recent studies have shown that it's when food has been particularly abundant during the previous breeding season and a tremendous number of young birds have been produced that there isn't enough room within the usual range for most of these birds, and more of them come south. Here, we sometimes see birds of very wide-ranging ages, including extremely white ones. This one, of course, is an extremely young bird, probably a first-year bird. Here around New York, we see them mainly on beaches. But to me, one of the most interesting things that I found working on this book was that some snowy owls winter at very high latitudes over in the ocean, spending the winter on ice floes and then venturing out over the sea to catch adjacent seabirds in the waters around the ice floes. Let's look briefly at some long distance migrants. Next, please, focusing on warblers. There are 40 species of warblers that move essentially into that narrow range of the Caribbean islands and then parts of Mexico down through Colombia, with a few going much farther, like the blackpoll warbler. How do they avoid competition here? Some have very discrete ranges that are non-overlapping. The bay-breasted and the Cape May, which have vast ranges in the boreal forest, almost entirely overlapping, winter in completely different areas. Bay-breasteds mainly in Panama and Costa Rica. And before I go to this slide of the Cape May, Gabriel said, why are you showing a bay-breasted in breeding plumage? Well, I looked at the specimens at the American Museum, and it's during the second half of February and March that they molt into this plumage long before they have left their wintering area. So molting into the alternate or breeding plumage is part of the program for many birds during the winter. Next, please. So here's the Cape May in fall plumage, just to remind us that this is the bird that goes to the Caribbean islands and avoids competition entirely with the bay-breasteds that it has been in contact with all through the spring and summer. A lot of birds of these warblers have overlapping ranges, however. In Jamaica, for example, there are 18 warblers that spend the winter there and another 12 that move through going farther south every fall and then coming back in the spring. What do they do? Next, please. The northern water thrush is one that has a territory that it defends each winter, just as it defends its breeding territory and returns to it again in the summer. The very first work on the territoriality in highly migratory birds was with the northern water thrush on the campus of the University of Caracas in Venezuela, done in the 1970s, and that woke up a lot of ornithologists to look more carefully at what do these birds, warblers, and other long-distance migrants do during the winter. Next, here's the Louisiana water thrush, and as you know, in the breeding season, they partition ecologically, the Louisiana favoring running water, the northern water thrush favoring still water and boggy areas. Where they overlap in winter, they each stick to that habitat, but if they're in a place that the other is absent, they spread out to the other habitat as well. Next, please. The black and white warbler, as you know, favors and feeds entirely on the bark of major limbs and trunks of trees. So it doesn't care what other warblers are around it during the winter. It has a territory that is just focused on the major surfaces of trees. Next. The worm-eating warbler has a very specialized winter diet. In the breeding season, when it's with us, it feeds mainly on insects that are in living foliage. But in its wintering area, 75% of its diet comes from insects that it probes, that it gets by probing into curled up dead leaves and flowers like this. Next. Some birds in overlapping areas with other species are dominant over others. So the yellow warbler, for example, is dominant over next the magnolia warbler. Next. So, and others have hierarchies within their own species. Next, please, the redstart. For example, redstarts, at least in the Caribbean islands, which have a wet season from the time that these birds are arriving into about January, when it changes to a dry season, the male redstarts go to the preferred habitat or the more insect-rich habitat of mangroves and other wet areas that stay wet through the entire season that they are there, while female redstarts are generally found in scrub and drier habitats, and so are most of the young birds. There are a few others that are habitat specialists. Next, please. The Kentucky warbler spends the winter in deep forest, which is one of the reasons that in Mexico and Central America, where so many of these forests have been cut and are being cut, this is a rapidly declining species. Next, the one back, please, to the chestnut-sided warbler. This is a bird that feeds mainly in the winter in forest edges. And then finally, next, Gabriel, the Tennessee warbler is one that moves around in flocks and isn't really territorial at all, except in the vines where it is probing for nectar in the flowers or for insects. It drives away others from its close proximity, but doesn't have any fixed territory. Next, there are a few North American birds that winter in the tropics that have a sequence of territories. This is much more widespread in Africa, where the bulk of Eurasian birds, long-distance migrants, winter. But here in Amazonia, where Veeries, spend the winter, they go first to an area that has not yet been flooded by the rains that are going to flood much of the Amazon basin. When the area that they start in the water does start rising, they move to other parts of the Amazon where either the floodwaters have already receded or have not yet come. So they move from one spot to another on a regular basis midway through the winter. Next, please. The purple martin has a three-step migration, at least for some of them, starting in Colombia, then going to Amazonian Brazil, and then some move farther south into Bolivia. This is thought to be to avoid overcrowding because they winter spread out over large areas, but roosting in high concentrations in enormous flocks of hundreds of thousands in islands, in rivers, and in wetlands that are secure roosting spots. But these get so crowded that some of the martins move on to Bolivia as a third stop to avoid the crowding and the roosts in Amazonian Brazil. Next, please. One of the things that we have learned so much about in the last 20 years that individual birds have been tracked with satellites and other devices, is that there are a tremendous number of species that have what is called migratory connectivity, such as the wood thrush, where all the wood thrushes from a given breeding region winter in the same region. They don't scatter out over the entire wintering region, so that the wood thrushes of the Northeast winter essentially from eastern Honduras to Costa Rica, while the wood thrushes of the Southeast and Midwest are wintering in the Yucatan Peninsula to western Honduras. So this has enormous conservation implications for knowing how to preserve the populations on their breeding range by being sure you are preserving the areas that they all winter in. Let's talk a bit about spatial and social. Yes, next one. Thanks, Gabriel. Spatial and social organizations during winter. I've already mentioned territoriality. A lot of birds have winter territories. Mockingbirds, non-migratory ones, have winter territories that are determined essentially by the amount of fruit that they see that is going to be available to carry them through the winter. Excuse me. And here in New York, you can hear what mockingbirds singing right now from penthouses and other places where they are spending the winter, using song to declare their winter territory, just as they do in spring and summer for their breeding territory. Next, the hermit thrush, a short distance migrant, sings softly when it arrives at its winter destination, maintaining a territory there and using that territory again in subsequent years. Next, please. Sorry, I forgot that I don't have another slide of the yellow warbler, but the yellow warbler is a long-distance migrant that has a territory, and in some parts of Mexico, males have been observed driving away 29 other species. The males of yellow warblers inhabit the canopy while females are in the understory, so that there is not only territoriality and hierarchy among the species that are there, but also within the species. Next, please. So I have sanderlings here because sanderlings, like many migrant and wintering shorebirds, also have territories during the time that the tide is out and feeding areas are exposed that aren't otherwise available. And at that point, these sanderlings would split up and each one would have a territory running along the beach for just a few meters that it occupies only for the hours that the low tide exposes the feeding areas, and then they return into their flocking behavior. Next, please. Some other birds, like the golden-winged warbler, have adopted local mixed species flocks and use them as their territory, defending the mixed species flock excuse me, against other golden-winged warblers. If there are other warblers that join that flock, North American warblers, they probably don't defend it against those, just against conspecifics. Next, please. So back here, the tufted titmice, at least those that are in their normal range rather than the ones invading us right now, they stay in their same territory through the winter, and their young stay with them, unlike the chickadees, where it's young from other birds that join the dominant pair. And where titmice and chickadees are together, the titmice are dominant over the chickadees. Next, please. So there's segregation by age and sex and habitat, as I've mentioned. The redstart is a classic example where, as I've said, the males are in the preferred wetter areas. And if males are removed experimentally, females and young birds will move into those spots. Next, please. But among hooded warblers, where males prefer forest and females occupy scrub, where males have been removed, females don't go into those vacant territories. They evidently prefer the scrub. Finally, there are also floaters, wood thrushes among them, that don't ever find a territory and just drift around at the margins of other territories, hoping to find a vacancy if one exists, or otherwise just skulking around at the margins. And these birds have far lower overwinter survival than the ones that do have territories. There are other birds that spend the winter in flocks, and there are many benefits from this. Safety in numbers, that other birds are within the flock are likely always to be vigilant. And flocking species are usually ones that feed on superabundant resources like large amounts of fruit in trees where birds couldn't defend the crop in any case against others, or where the food is very patchy and they have to move around looking for it, and there's no point defending a stable territory because there isn't going to be food there all the time. Another reason that some birds stay in flocks is because roosting sites are scarce. We see this particularly in shorebirds, where some birds may spread out to feed during the low tides, but rejoin flocks to roost. Next, please. So sandpipers like these are sanderlings, spend much of their time in flocks when they're not feeding. And in some places, they have to retreat to areas at high tide that are very near vegetation. And rather than staying there where hawks and falcons can sneak up on them, they will spend several hours during the high tide flying out over the sea in flocks in what we call aerial migration, where there's less danger of being caught by any predator, and they evidently have sufficient energy reserves that they can do this without exhausting themselves. So for a few hours before the tide reaches its apogee and a few hours after, you can see flocks of dunlin, flocks of sanderlings, and maybe some other sandpiper species as well, out over the ocean at some distance away from where falcons or hawks would pursue them. Now let's think about competition. Next, please. What did I want to say about juncos that I've already forgotten? Oh yes, so the plumage differences among the juncos give them a hierarchy where they are together, and so the adult males, the darkest birds, are the most dominant, and it runs down through the females and the younger birds. So for them, plumage is the indicator of dominance and each bird's hierarchy within the flock. Next, please. For kingbirds, they flock because they have switched their diet from insects, which require them to be territorial and, as we know, very aggressive when they're on their territories, to superabundant fruit that it would be a waste of energy and impossible to defend the source. So they move around in flocks. And as I've already mentioned with the golden-winged warbler, some birds join the mixed species flocks that already know the sources of food and are much more alert to the dangers within their habitat than the new-coming naive birds. Now we can talk about competition. Next, please. So it's unclear how much competition there really is between North American winterers and the resident birds of the tropics. In a few species that have ranges that include both North American migrants and tropical resident birds like turkey vultures, it was found that on the Venezuelan llanos that the resident vultures, slightly smaller, retreated when the North American birds were there to the gallery forests, leaving the more open areas that have much more scavenging opportunities, including roadkill, to the North American migrants. And then when the North American migrants leave, the resident vultures return to those habitats for their breeding season. Among smaller birds, like warblers and the resident insect-eating birds in the tropics, it's been found that most of the migrant birds, wintering birds, take smaller prey, they work harder, they're often still feeding in the rain when the resident birds have had enough and are taking shelter, and they eat distasteful ants and beetles. And there's also an anatomical difference, which I had a good time examining in the bird department, where migrant vireos and migrant flycatchers from North America generally have shorter bills than their resident congeners in the tropics, which feed generally on much larger insects and therefore need the larger bills to catch them. Let's talk a little bit about survival. During the winter, finding food and avoiding predators are the two things that occupy birds. Among warblers that spend the winter in the tropics, there's a 90% survival rate from the time they arrive until they depart, which is much higher than the overwinter survival rate among non-migrants that stay at our latitudes. Many of them shift their diet, such as the kingbirds that I mentioned before. They, in fact, become specialists in one tree that grows on the eastern side of the Andes, from Bolivia all the way up through Colombia and then into Panama. The tree is called Didymo panax moritotoni. And when the kingbirds arrive in Bolivia, that's just when the local trees of this species come into full fruit. The kingbirds devour the fruit, disseminate the seeds, and as they exhaust that crop, they move north into Peru and eventually to Ecuador, Colombia, so forth, in synchrony with this tree's fruiting, so that all along the way, these are a key species in the survival and dissemination of this tree, just as it is the provider of a reliable, superabundant food source for the kingbird. Next, please. Among birds that don't winter so far south, we know that the yellow-rumped warbler and also the tree swallow both shift their diets from insects to bayberry. And studies have been done with the yellow-rumped warbler, which has found that it has the digestive enzymes to deal with bayberries, while when bayberries were fed experimentally to yellow warblers and other species, they simply couldn't digest these. So the yellow-rumped warbler, the tree swallow, have evolved special ways to consume food that enables them to have a much shorter migration and avoid competition with other species of the same ecological niche that they share in spring and summer. Another way that birds acclimate to or survive the cold is by acclimation in several ways. Plumage, for example. Snowy owls have feathers all the way down to the tips of their toes. And in experiments that have put snowy owl in, what shall we call it, cold chambers, where they were subjected to cold at 80 degrees Celsius below zero, far colder than anything they would encounter in the wild, the snowy owls were not at all bothered and survived perfectly well. For most smaller birds, they have the opportunity to fluff up their feathers, and just like our down coats, have more air trapped in them, keeping them warm. But there's a balance that these birds have to maintain between being fluffed up and less maneuverable versus being sleek and easier able to escape any prey. Fat reserves, it's the same balance. Birds store less fat, far less fat during the winter than they do on migration when they need it to fuel long flights. And most of them fatten up most at the end of the day when they need that to carry them through the long and cold winter night. But earlier during the day, they eat less, except first thing in the morning when they are refueling, because they need to preserve their agility. Some birds also adjust their behavior during the day to different temperature regimes, so that chickadees in extremely cold weather move much more slowly and go to roost earlier, because it's more efficient just to go to roost than to continue looking for food in the last hours of daylight on cold days, because the amount of movement involved is energetically draining. Next, please. Then roosting habits also change during the winter. Ruffed grouse and many small birds, including snow buntings, redpolls, even wrens, roost in snow burrows. They fly into soft snow so that as their velocity projects them into the snow falls behind them, so there's no visible entrance that a predator would find, and then they work their way out of the snow, sometimes using a different exit later the next morning. Next, please. Other birds roost in cavities, which are highly desirable all through the year, but particularly in winter when they keep birds warm, and are also freer from many predators than roosting in open exposed situations. And during winter, many birds will roost in groups, which further insulates them. Bluebirds will occupy tree cavities and birdhouses with several in them. Winter wrens, as many as 89, have been counted in a single hole. Some birds use hypothermia, chickadees, for example, and a few other small birds that winter in high latitudes, where every night they automatically drop their temperature by about 10 degrees Celsius to reduce their internal fuel consumption and get through the night much more efficiently than if they had consumed as much as they had accumulated during the day. Hummingbirds do this at high latitudes, and so do sunbirds at high latitudes, and a number of other small birds. The only bird that's known to actually do anything close to hibernation, torpor, is the poorwill, which can sleep for several days without moving and without feeding. It's suspected that some other nightjars may do this, but nothing conclusive has been found the way many poorwills have been found sleeping for days in the Southwest. Let's talk now a little bit about conservation. It's useful to use the acronym that E.O. Wilson devised, HIPPO, to think about the different conservation issues. It stands for habitat, invasives, pollution, population, meaning human population, and overharvest. And from the seasonal point of view for conservation, it's important to know what seasons and what locales have the greatest impact on populations, their survival and their reproduction. So, for example, for woodland passerines, the young of migrants survive winter about half as well as adults, but the young of resident birds survive only a quarter as well as adult birds through the winter. So let's take these different letters of the acronym. Habitat loss. The Bachman's warbler is the most vivid example of a bird that wintered essentially on Cuba and the Isle of Pines, wintering in cane brakes, just as it bred in cane brakes, but also in North America in laurel thickets. But in Cuba and the Isle of Pines, that habitat has been completely lost during the 20th century, and that is believed to be the cause of extinction for the Bachman's warbler, not anything that has happened in its breeding range. Next, please. There are other birds like the piping plover that we still don't even know all of its wintering range. There are surveys that have been done recently in various Bahama islands that have found substantial populations of piping plovers from North America, wintering ones, that were unknown a few years ago. So this is just one example of a bird that we don't even know where all of them spend the winter. And so conserving these sites or conserving these species is difficult because we don't have the information on what are the sites that need to be protected. Next, please. We know that some birds can adapt to modified habitats. So the cerulean warbler, for example, does very well in its wintering area in Colombia in shade coffee, where trees are planted over the coffee, and these provide enough insects for cerulean warblers and some of the resident birds. It's not perfect for all the resident birds because there's almost nothing to be found in the coffee trees underneath, but there are some birds for which we can manage wintering habitats to increase what's available for them. Of invasive species, there's so many plants and animals, but let's just mention the feral cats and house cats that are let outside. Because in the US alone, it is estimated that 1.3 to 1.4 million birds are killed every year, more than pesticides, more than collisions with buildings and other sources. And I mentioned this as a winter problem because there are far more birds in the suburbanized areas that have all these feral cats and house cats that are let out during the winter than there are in any other season of the year. Pollution, too obvious, we hardly need to say anything about that, so widespread, but I think particularly about whooping cranes, that are in Texas Gulf Coast wetlands during the winter, as opposed to their highly pristine breeding areas in Canada, where while these areas have been given protection, they are still receiving the effluent from all the surrounding areas that include pesticides, herbicides, petroleum hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and industrial pollutants. Population, by which we mean human population. Again, this is a case where many birds are not exposed to many people except during winter. And I think particularly of the birds that use beaches and mountains, because nowadays it's hard to find a beach in winter in the southern areas where birds spend the winter that isn't occupied by vast numbers of people, their dogs, and vehicles. And likewise, mountains, the work on this has been done particularly in Europe, where most ski resorts are at exactly the same elevations that very sensitive grouse like capercaillie spend the winter and cannot tolerate the disturbance. I think I have a slide of a sanderling next, but doesn't matter whether we do or not, but let's see. Yes, it's there. So that's just to illustrate birds in winter in areas that used to be fairly undisturbed, but are now almost entirely occupied by vacationers. Then over harvest, we think first of waterfowl being harvested. This is pretty well regulated, but there is a catch here because most waterfowl, at least freshwater ducks, pair up during the winter, which you can see in Central Park or any place else that has a lot of them, so that when the hunting season begins the 1st of November, it's not particularly significant if some of them are shot. But by January and February, the last month of the hunting season, these birds are all paired. And so if some of them are shot, there's often not enough time for the surviving birds to find another mate. And in some places, there is a lot of pressure to extend the shooting season into March, which would be even more catastrophic to paired birds losing a mate and not having the time to find another. And finally, the more serious problem of overharvest is for seabirds that in the southern oceans, albatrosses, petrels, shearwaters, penguins are caught in long lines and gill nets that run for miles. The same problem in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, particularly with alcids. Some of this is regulated. How much the regulations are enforced, it's hard to say. There are many ways to reduce the mortality by dropping the baited long lines deeper into the water to catch the same fish that they would catch near the surface, but making them too difficult to reach for albatrosses and petrels. As far as gill nets, that's a tougher situation to find a way to deal with them, except to put them in areas that are not significantly used. And again, this is substantially a winter problem in these latitudes because that's when more birds are out in the open ocean rather than closer to their breeding areas, particularly in the northern hemisphere where alcids don't feed as far from their breeding colonies as they disperse over the winter into other prime fishing areas. And finally, let's talk a bit about climate change, which of course is just another form of pollution, but it exacerbates all the other elements of HIPPO. Some of the impacts on habitats include sea level rise, which reduces coastal wintering areas, snow cover contracts, precipitation increases at high latitudes and decreases in subtropical ones, droughts are longer and more intense, and severe storms expand north of where they traditionally were. The first area where we see changes in a wintering range, I think we have a slide of a robin here. Thanks, yes. Robins, which at least in New York used to be considered a harbinger of spring, are now with us all through the year because there's less snow. Robins traditionally shifted to feeding on fruit in trees in the winter, which they still do, but the winters are so much milder that they can now forage on the ground as well, farther north than they used to. For all these birds that have expanded their wintering range farther north, I think this is pretty benign. Many of them are spending less time in their wintering range, so that next, please, golden eagles have been found in Michigan and Minnesota to spend 30 fewer days south of the observatories where they are normally tracked on their way south in the fall and north in the spring. Again, is this particularly of concern? Probably not. Next, the raptors that continue to stay on their normal migratory schedule are the ones that go farthest to the tropics. Ospreys and next broad-winged hawks are the ones that stay pretty much on the same schedule because their motivation to migrate has more to do with changes in day length than it does with local weather conditions. The other interesting thing that's been found, particularly in Europe, is that many of the birds that only raise small birds now that only raise a single brood and are arriving north earlier in the spring, finish raising that brood, molt, and are prepared to migrate and depart earlier at the end of summer than they used to. I haven't heard much from banding stations in this country that they are finding the same phenomenon of an earlier migration among birds that raise a single brood and head south sooner. But one of the things that the banding stations have noted is that in the last few decades, birds like warblers have an average weight that is less than it used to be. And this is in response to the warmer environments in which they live because birds with less weight, birds that are smaller, dissipate heat faster than large birds. So we're seeing physical adaptations to changing climate here, as well as we're seeing behavioral adaptations. The birds that have the biggest challenge are the birds that winter in tropical areas where their signals to migrate north are changes in day length, and where what is happening at their northern destinations or on the way is completely unknown to them. And as we know, what's happening on their way north and at their destinations is that spring is coming earlier and earlier, which means that trees are leafing out sooner and that the insects that feed on those leaves are emerging sooner. This is what's called a phenological disjunct. And again, the best work on this has been done in Europe with the pied flycatcher, which winters in Africa south of the Sahara. And now the emergence of the caterpillars that it feeds its young is about 3 weeks earlier than it was maybe four or 5 decades ago. Those caterpillars are being harvested by the resident birds, mainly tits, that are in those woods all through the years. And while some of the pied flycatchers have accelerated their arrival somewhat, they are not accelerating their arrival at the same rate that spring is advancing there. So in many areas, they are having very poor productivity of young, and their populations are declining. And this is a bird that cannot adapt by inching its wintering range farther north because there's a huge belt of the Sahara where they couldn't possibly winter. So there's a northern limit in the Sahel, the area south of the Sahara, where these birds can spend the winter, and they will not be able to adapt incrementally to the change in what's happening in the spring, where they are breeding at the rate that is actually happening. A few other impacts that we can mention. Next, please. Canada jays store food in the winter, animal food, because they begin nesting in late winter when there's little food available to feed their young. And so they use these caches that they have formed in the winter to feed their young. But at least in Ontario, the winters are now so warm that the animal caches are rotting, so that they don't have the food that they need to feed their young when the young are there at the end of winter and early spring. Another impact, next slide, please. Bank swallows, this work has been done in Africa and Hungary. Bank swallows also winter south of the Sahara in the Sahel, West Africa, and in dry years, and there are more and more dry years there are fewer insects. The bank swallows are in poorer condition. That means they migrate north later, and they have more difficulty because they're in poor condition and arriving later as well, finding enough food for their young. So this is continuing negative reinforcement cycle that is affecting them. I could give you some more examples, but we're running short on time. So I thank you, and I will be happy to take questions on anything that I've talked about or any other winter aspect that I haven't, because there's a lot more that happens in winter that there just isn't time to talk about.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Gabriel Willow. I'm the Vice President of the Linnean Society of New York, and a big thank you to you, Roger, for this absolutely fascinating presentation. I would have been happy if you kept going, for one, because you just have so much fantastic information. But I'm sure that folks do want to ask some questions. So yeah, so I'll just give folks a chance to get their thoughts together. If you have questions, there's a Q&A button. If you hover your cursor below your Zoom screen, you'll see that, and you can type them in there. Actually, you mentioned that this a lot of this information is from your book, and I know that you have a copy there. I was just wondering if you could hold that book up so everybody can see.
Sure. I don't see myself on the screen. Have you done your magic so that I'm back to others?
Oh, well, hang on. That's a good point. Let me stop sharing the presentation. There we go.
So now we have the title page of the presentation on my screen.
Yes. Well, you know, it's funny. The share button says new share. Here it is. Stop share. Thank you. There we go.
So now
you're paying attention.
So here's the book, Princeton Press, 2019. If you find it in any bookstore, I'll be amazed and impressed, but you can always get it from Princeton. You can probably get it from Amazon and other places too, but frankly, I'd rather the money went to Princeton than to Amazon and all its packaging and transportation costs, but get it where you can find it.
Well, it's beautiful. It's got a winter finch on it. We love to see that. Yeah, I guess the finch forecast this winter wasn't supposed to be too good for our region, but there's already pine siskins and evening grosbeaks turning up in the area, so maybe it'll be a good one. And with this influx of chickadees, I definitely am keeping my ear out for boreal chickadees. I'm hoping one might wander down, although they haven't been reported in New York City in 20 or 30 years. We have some questions popping up now. I guess before I dive into those, a sort of basic question: what prompted your interest in winter survival, and what led you to write this book?
Well, where were we? In 1976, when I was writing my first book, this one, Watching Birds, An Introduction to Ornithology, I saw that there were lots of books about migration and breeding behavior, but there was very little information on what birds do in winter, which I had to include in this book. So I did what research I could, and I wrote a chapter on that. And I was fascinated, and I said to my editor that I think this would make a good book. My editor then at Houghton Mifflin in 1977, when this was published, he said, "Oh, it's much too specialized." So I was interested in doing it for decades and decades. And finally, when I stopped working and had finished another book on paintings of Central Park, I turned to this because I wanted to do it. And of course, in that time, vastly more information has become available from all over the world, as well as the benefits of so many new kinds of technology that weren't around in the 70s, so that today's book is infinitely more comprehensive, although it's still opening up new fields rather than answering all the questions. But that's how I got started, and I waited for close 30 years, I guess it is, or 30 or 40 years until I had the chance to do it.
Wow. So the book was a long time coming. That's fantastic. Well, it does seem like we're constantly learning new things. I mean, it's my understanding that the wintering range and habitat of the purple martin was something that was just sort of discovered fairly recently, right? That because of maybe some GPS devices or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're constantly
all the purple martins from Atlantic to Pacific all funnel into South America and mix, and there's no genetic difference among them. They probably have a fair degree of connectivity on the other end, so that they're returning to the same area where they bred or were hatched previously, but they all funnel into central Amazonia, and then some of them move on to Bolivia to avoid the crowds.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating. I was in Costa Rica last winter, and on the sort of Cordilleran ridge right down the middle, there were Townsend's warbler and black-throated green warbler, which in their breeding range are thousands of miles apart on the east and west coast respectively, and they funnel down. And by the time they're in Costa Rica and Panama, they're mingling, or they do, I guess, typically inhabit one side of the mountain range or the other, but right at the top you can see both, and that was kind of cool to be like, oh yeah, here they're seeing their distant cousins. All right, let me get into these questions here. Several chickadee related questions. Rosemary wants to know if chickadees store any of the seeds, because you mentioned earlier about their different behaviors when there's feeders or not feeders. Do they end up caching the seeds from backyard feeders?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that you can see them doing, carrying away a seed. Now, chickadees would probably carry away a seed just to eat it in a less exposed, less dangerous place. But most of what they're doing is diligently carrying them away, and carrying them away far enough that they're hoping that no other chickadee is going to see them where they cache it. And they look very carefully as they're doing this to be sure that nobody is watching them.
Yeah, it's interesting because most homeowners will probably just keep filling the feeders all through the winter, but I guess the chickadees still have that instinctual urge to hide seeds for the winter, even though they could just get new seeds.
Well, they may. The thing to remember about chickadees, and one reason that the feeders are not significant to them, is that most of their food comes from bark surfaces on trees and shrubs and branches. And unless those trees are covered by ice or covered by snow for a long period, between what they have cached and what they can find routinely, they don't have a problem. It's different for, as I said before, the Carolina wren and birds where their normal feeding substrate is entirely covered. But trees are usually free of snow and ice, except in extreme situations. So the birds can pick up what they have cached or find new things, insects that are living in the bark all through the winter.
Yeah, I'm always impressed that any bird can find insects in the winter. I mean, like golden crowned kinglets are entirely insectivorous as far as I know, and they're here all winter, and even further north. It's pretty amazing. They're just very diligently checking all those little nooks and crannies. Another chickadee related question. When the hippocampus of the chickadee grows to increase that memory, does it gain new nerve cells?
That's a very interesting question that is beyond my ability to answer.
I was thinking that. I was like, that sounds pretty specialized.
Whether just as fat cells can expand and contract, and cells can expand and contract based on the amount of water within them, I am guessing that the same number of cells may simply expand with their neural connections rather than gaining additional neural connections. That would seem to me the more evolutionarily efficient way, but I don't have an answer.
I mean, regardless, it's remarkable. And I've heard that actually scientists are researching the ability of birds to add new memory portions of the brain as a way of potentially studying human memory loss, and that we tend to lose over time the memory parts of our brain. And so there might be some application there. This is an interesting question. I've not really thought about this. Someone wants to know, what is the effect of feral cats in the tropics compared to their effects in, say, suburban US? And they also say thanks and great presentation.
Thank you. So in the tropics, I am sure that in comparable neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, there are probably plenty of feral cats out there too, as well as house cats that are let out for the day. But there, I'm not sure that any studies have been done there, but remember that there, even in a suburban neighborhood of Sao Paulo or San Jose or any place else, there are so many other wild predators that these birds are at greater risk from all kinds of predation than they are here, where the addition of the feral cat to an otherwise relatively predator-free landscape, except for accipiters, we're talking about suburban landscapes that have a lot of cats, it makes a significant difference. So I don't have any informed answer, but I'm hypothesizing that it will have an impact wherever there are feral or house cats let out, but the house cats themselves have more competition for birds than they do up here.
Yep. And just to make sure I got the number right, you said it was 1.3 to 1.6 billion, right? That
1.3 to 1.4, but these are statistics that came to me when I was writing this book in 2018 from the American Bird Conservancy. The more they study this, the greater they find that the problem is.
Yeah, I've heard numbers up to 3 billion annually in North America, which is hard to comprehend. That sounds like all the birds are getting eaten by cats. It's mind-boggling, really. Yeah, I mean, I guess they're the number one source of mortality effect, source for songbirds,
right?
Which is pretty wild.
Ground feeders far more than any other kinds of birds.
Well, we still have no shortage of white-throated sparrows, from what I can tell. Let's see here. Doug wants to is curious about neotropical migrants. How many migrant passerines join mixed flocks of tropical resident species? So he's saying he's seen, for example, in the tropics, very few joining mixed flocks of resident tanager species, for example.
Well, much depends on where you have been, because of course most of the best flocks of mixed species flocks are in Amazonia or put it this way. You've got the flocks in Amazonia and other places where there are army ants that feed on the ground, highly specialized. There are not many North American birds that join them, although there are some wintering thrushes that do feeding on the ground. And then you have the understory flocks that often move in the same direction in coordination with the ground foraging flocks. And most of the work on this has been done in Amazonia, where there are relatively few North American warblers, and more of the North American warblers that winter in South America, that far south, are in the higher elevations on the slopes of the Andes rather than in the lowlands. So, so far as I have read, if you go to places like the Caribbean, where there are mixed species flocks, there's some birds that join, some migrant birds that join them in Mexico and Central America, but it's not used by as many of the warblers as, in fact, prefer to establish a territory, or like the Cape May warbler, which is the only warbler that has a tubular tongue and spends the winter sucking the juices out of fruit, uses a different food source that doesn't need the benefit of local expertise from local resident flocks.
Yes. Yeah. I guess, right. I guess those are sort of two different things, like the resident flocks, sort of roving flocks of tanager species, for example, which are sort of analogous, I guess, to the flocks you see here of titmice and chickadees and kinglets. It's true what Douglas says. I haven't seen that many migrants with those, but like as you say, I have also seen migrants with following army ant swarms. But I guess that's just a buffet that nobody can resist. You know what I've seen following army ant swarms in Belize and in the Yucatan, which is fun, is Swainson's warblers. I've watched them hopping along the ground following.
The ground feeding warbler.
Yep. And then, like you say, wood thrushes. I've seen wood thrushes doing that. That's true. Now, here's an interesting question about those birds in the tropics. I kind of wondered this myself. I guess this would just be for ones that are actually in equatorial regions or at the equator. You mentioned the day length as a signal to return, but if they're at the equator, day length doesn't really change. So what other signals do they have, or what's going on there?
Well, it changes extremely subtly. And studies of birds have shown that that they do register these very subtle changes, and presumably this has been done in laboratory situations the same way as people like Steve Emlin did the first work on Tsuganru on migratory restlessness, where if you change the amount of day length extremely subtly, as it does happen near the equator, the birds have the same restlessness. The interesting thing to me is that for some birds, the ones that winter south of the equator, and of course many birds winter far south of the equator, particularly shorebirds going all the way down to Argentina and Chile, for them the signal is not increases in day length, but decreases in day length, just as in the spring. But as they cross the equator, where they're still on a schedule, think of the knots that winter in Argentina and have several staging areas, the last being, let's say, Florida, before they come up to Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay and Jamaica Bay. They are moving through a series of stages where first it's decreasing day length and then increasing day length. That's telling them how soon they should take the next long flight.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. My neighbor's dog is barking. Were those original Zuganruhe studies the ones where the birds, where there's a little sort of bowl of ink they were sitting in, there'd be little inky footprints? Yeah. Right. I was like picturing that. Right. And they would hop predominantly in the direction they wanted to migrate in. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Very elegant, simple study, and just cute too, the little inky footprints. Let's see here. I wondered this myself. Ursula was wondering, have there been any adaptations seen in the Canada jays remedying the rotting food problem?
Not that I'm aware of. The papers about this phenomenon are all from the last decade or so. I haven't seen anything, and I don't know what the adaptation would be. But I haven't seen any of the studies that have been done in Ontario showing any greater success among Canada jays.
I guess the adaptation would be food that is more resistant to spoilage, or they have to dry their moose meat into like moose jerky, store it that way. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes go birding in the Adirondacks with Joan Collins. I don't know if you know Joan, but she's also observed the blue jays are expanding northward, probably as a result of climate change, and she's been observing them following the Canada jays and stealing their caches, which is interesting.
All corvids are very smart and quite unscrupulous.
Yeah. So they're facing multiple challenges. I guess they're just going to have to probably retreat northward where these things are less of an issue.
Well,
ultimately,
Canada jays already have retreated northward. I used to see Canada jays on Mount Desert Island in Maine in the mid-1970s. And I've gone back many times to the same place where I saw a family in 1976. Haven't seen them.
Yeah, I went to college on MDI and lived there for 5 years. Yeah, College of the Atlantic.
I didn't know you were there.
I never remember seeing Canada jays. Okay, yeah.
The Ohio Fire Trail in Southwest Harbor is where I used to see them in the 70s.
Yeah, I never remember seeing one on MDI, but I'd see them up further down east, once in a while on Schoodic, and then going up from there, Jonesport and stuff. So yes, they've shifted. And of course, there was those classic warbler studies done there, that classical ecology paper from like the 50s or 60s on MDI with breeding Blackburnian and other species that don't breed there anymore either.
MacArthur and Wilson. Blackburnians are still on the island.
Oh, they are. Yeah. Okay.
They may not be in Bass Harbor where that study was done, but they're certainly in the woods in Seal Harbor. Okay,
very cool. But yeah, we'll have to talk about College of the Atlantic sometime. Let's see here. A couple of good questions here about conservation and habitat preservation. Someone wants to know if the extent of shade-grown coffee is growing and if it's providing greater bird habitat as there's more awareness around shade-grown coffee.
Yes, well, shade-grown coffee depends on there being a demand and a market for it, which sort of emerged a few decades ago. I don't drink coffee at all, so I don't shop for coffee, and I don't follow whether any of the mass consumers of coffee, like Starbucks, have preferential buying policies. But but well, that's really as much as I can say. I simply don't know to what extent more farmers are using shade-grown varieties rather than sun-grown varieties. It must depend on the market as well as the problems that they're having. In Guatemala, I know there has been a blight on coffee the last several years, and some coffee growers have simply abandoned coffee growing entirely. So there are a lot of factors, and but I think market demand is going to be the greatest driver.
Well, and I would add for this person, since they're interested, that I believe shade grown doesn't have to mean, it doesn't define in the shade of what the over canopy is. And so it could be in the shade of a banana plantation or a palm oil plantation. It's not inherently better. So what you really want to look for is something that's like Rainforest Alliance certified or a bird friendly. The Smithsonian has a bird friendly coffee certification, and that ensures that the overstory is native species, right, so that it's not just in a shade of whatever. So that's really the better a better way to know that it's good habitat for the birds. And there's a Brooklyn-based company called Birds and Beans, who I don't get a kickback from or anything, but I'll just throw it out there. They're one of the ones that has bird-friendly coffee certification. And then I think the American Birding Association also has a coffee that they sell. So you could look for some specifically bird-friendly coffee if you're a coffee drinker and wanted to support that. And along those lines, Jill asks if there's any suggestions for referrals to any organizations, places for potential donations that efficiently preserve habitat.
Yes, there are lots. And it depends. Well, there's so many, but there are two that I particularly am impressed with. One, the Rainforest Trust, and I have to say that I'm on its advisory council, which focuses on buying lands that are extensive forests or other tropical habitats, particularly ones that have a high degree of endemicity. And it also does a certain amount of work with designations to get government agencies to designate protected areas rather than buying them. The other organization that I'm very impressed with is Nature and Culture, which focuses mainly on working with government agencies rather than private landowners, and focuses mainly on the designation aspect, which is dollar per dollar much more efficient than purchases. But purchases are still necessary in some places where that's the only land that is important for a particular species is privately owned, and the only way to ensure its protection is to buy it. Both of these organizations work very extensively with organizations in each of these countries that are taking on the real responsibility of ensuring that these places are protected over the long term. I'm sure that there are many other organizations less obvious than the Nature Conservancy, which is working globally. And if you read the Times today, you see that the Nature Conservancy is very involved in a lot of marine protection and a lot of financial mechanisms that encourage governments as well as private landowners to manage their land better. Just as in the United States, they're working with a lot of private landowners to manage land sustainably for birds and total ecosystem preservation.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, I think this will be our last question, and I'm glad someone asked, because I was going to ask this if nobody did. You talked about chickadees and tufted titmice and the titmouse eruption. For the last 18 months or so, there's been basically no tufted titmice in New York City, which is very curious because they were a resident breeding species in Central Park and Prospect Park. They all just vanished.
Right.
And then this season, they're all over the place. They're everywhere. They're more common than all this. Jude mentions they're more common than all the sparrows combined. I saw some myself out at Breezy Point in like sand dunes. I mean, they're just everywhere. What happened? Why did they all leave, and why are they all back?
I have no idea why they left. It's a fascinating question, because what has changed in places like Central Park that supported them for decades? But the only thing that I can add is that Dick Veed, if he's on this at this meeting, he's the one who pointed out to me from Staten Island that the titmice had been found moving northward. So this eruption, if you will, seems likely to be from farther south rather than the northern portions of their range. And whether farther south, there has been some enormously successful breeding season and these birds are moving north to find Lebensraum is just speculation. But you know, if when you collect titmice or just collect their feathers, you can now analyze the water content of the feather and where that feather was grown. And these feathers were grown in August and September when these birds molted. So using that method, we could determine where they are coming from. And this contrasts, interestingly, with the chickadees, which are likely to be coming from farther north, particularly because where we are, the limit of breeding chickadee, black-capped chickadees is the Raritan River. So surplus populations must be coming from farther north. But it would not be difficult either by whatever the proper name is for this water feather analysis, or by putting some satellite trackers on titmice that are in various places farther south and seeing where these birds go to learn what is the dispersal pattern here.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, my personal theory as to why they left the city was that maybe there was some other populations moving through. It's total, I just made this up, but it kind of makes sense to me. I don't know. Maybe there was some other migrant or eruptive populations moving through, and the local ones just kind of fell in with them and were like, "Oh, we're going this way. Okay, cool. We'll join you." I don't know. It seems like the only.
The last major influx of titmice was, I think, 2 autumns ago, into the winter. And from where I live, I'm surrounded by trees. 2 winters ago, and this winter, I've seen titmice looking around, building cracks in windows to cache things. But 2 winters ago, those birds pretty much vanished by December. And we'll see what happens this year.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to follow. Actually, I know I said that was the last question. I have one more question I want to get in here, just because I skipped it by accident. That's my fault. From Ben Kachese was wondering about aerial insectivores such as chimney swifts and common nighthawks, right, which seem to be declining overall. Are there known negative impacts where they winter, and what are the numbers looking like for these aerial insectivores?
Well, they're down, but it's hard to determine what all the causes of their decline are. Certainly for ground nesting birds like nighthawks, feral cats must be a problem. Second, the elimination in cities of the gravel roofs on which 50 or more years ago nighthawks nested regularly, that's eliminated local populations. There's no place in New York City that I know of, perhaps there are some that I haven't heard of, where nighthawks nest. But I can remember in the 1980s in Brooklyn, large numbers of nighthawks if you emerge from someplace at midnight in a lighted area. And I can also remember the years I lived in Washington, they were always around the White House where there were always lights on at night attracting insects. So farther south where they do winter, forest loss is probably a factor. But which factors are the most critical would be hard to say. As far as chimney swifts are concerned, certainly, and you might as well say for both of them, the decline in the number of aerial insects is important because we know that that's true. Nighthawks and chimney swifts are feeding on very different insects. Here in the breeding range, there are probably fewer vacant chimneys available for chimney swifts than there used to be. There are probably buildings that have been taken down. There are probably people who put wire mesh over their chimneys because they don't want birds tumbling in, whether they're starlings or chimney swifts or anything else. So those but could be reasons for decline in Amazonia, where chimney swifts winter. They're feeding in the sky with several other local Catura species. And I don't think there's any loss of insects there, but certainly the decline of aerial plankton here is very significant. It's amazing to me that the great numbers that we have roosting on migration here, where you can, at some chimneys that I have watched, you can count more than 1,000 during the peak of their fall migration going into these chimneys. They scatter widely all over the city and perhaps beyond, because they're not feeding over Fifth Avenue all day near the chimneys where I watch them, or over the Armory on Park Avenue and 66th Street. But it's marvelous to me to know that there are still so many insects available within the commuting range of chimney swifts that roost on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Roger. And several people have weighed in just to say how they enjoyed your talk and also how they enjoy your book. So hopefully folks can track down a copy. And yes, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation and for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of our viewers. We had well over 100 folks in attendance tonight. So thank you all for joining. And so on behalf of our president, Rochelle Thomas, and myself, I will officially adjourn this meeting. And I'll see you out in the park, Roger. Thank you again for joining us. What's that? Oh, it was not Riverside Park. The yellow-headed blackbird was in it was in Riverbank State Park with a flock of cowbirds.
That's in New York. That's in Manhattan somewhere?
Evidently. I have to admit, I'm not quite sure where it is. I have to look it up. I did not, in fact, taste that bird.
It's on 145th Street, 145th, everyone.
Thanks, Rochelle. Yeah. I guess it's worth checking to see if it's there tomorrow. It was with a flock of apparently about 80 cowbirds, and I guess it's a first for New York County, so that's kind of fun. And it's a nice, pretty colorful looking male. Someone sent a photo. So that's the bird news for the day. Yes, but thank you again. And I hope everybody will join us next month, although it is momentarily escaping me who is speaking next month. Rochelle, can you remember?
Jessica Waring.
Putting you on the spot. Yes, that's right. Thank you. So hopefully we'll see you all at that talk in a month's time.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Okay,
thanks,
bye.
Roger.